By 1943, German submarine crews had developed a thorough understanding of everything that could kill them. Depth charges could find them. Aircraft could find them. The moment the lights went out and the hull started groaning, they knew those sounds. They had trained for every one of those dangers. They had survived some of them. But there was one thing they trusted. One thing that was supposed to give them a fighting chance when everything else had failed. Every man aboard a German U-boat wore it clipped to his chest in combat. Every submarine school taught them exactly how to use it. Commanders drilled it into new crews until the procedure was automatic. It was called the Draeger apparatus. It weighed about 8 pounds. It promised to keep you alive long enough to reach the surface from a sunken submarine. It was the last line between a living sailor and the bottom of the Atlantic. And the men who wore it had almost no idea how often it failed. The Draeger apparatus had been standard equipment on German submarines since 1912. That is not a typo. Germany had been thinking about how to get men out of sunken submarines for more than 3 decades before the war started. The device went through multiple refinements over those years, and by 1939, the version carried aboard U-boats was a compact rebreather that crews wore like a life jacket, strapped to the chest. The design was straightforward in principle. A small oxygen cylinder fed fresh air into a rubber breathing bag. The sailor exhaled into the same bag, and his breath passed through a canister packed with soda lime, which chemically removed the carbon dioxide. Clean air cycled back to the mouthpiece. A nose clip prevented water from entering through the nostrils. With a mouthpiece inserted and the oxygen valve opened, a man could breathe underwater for somewhere between 15 and 45 minutes, depending on his depth and exertion level. Every U-boat crew trained with it. They practiced in pools at submarine school. They learned the procedure for the flooding equalization step, which was the part nobody liked to think about too long. To open the escape hatch underwater, a sailor first had to flood the compartment he was in. The sea pressure against the hatch was immense. It could not be forced. The only way to open it was to let the ocean in until the pressure inside matched the pressure outside, then turn the handle. The procedure was correct. The physics were sound. And in a training pool at 20 feet of depth, it worked exactly as advertised. The Atlantic Ocean was not a training pool. Germany wasn't alone in this thinking. The British Royal Navy equipped their submariners with a similar device called the Davis Submerged Escape Apparatus, adopted in 1927. The Americans used something called the Mommsen lung. Every major submarine navy in the war issued its men some version of the same promise. If the boat goes down, this device will bring you up. One American writer later suggested that the Mommsen lung concept may have killed more submariners than it rescued. The evidence for German crews suggested something similar. Here is the problem the device could not solve, and the one that made deep water escape almost always fatal. The Draeger apparatus supplied pure oxygen. At the surface, breathing pure oxygen is fine. A man breathes air that is about 21% oxygen, with the rest being nitrogen and trace gases. Giving him pure oxygen at the surface just means more of a good thing. But as a diver descends, the pressure increases. At 10 meters of depth, the pressure is already twice what it is at the surface. At 20 meters, 3 times. At 30 meters, 4 times. Oxygen under pressure becomes toxic. The body begins absorbing it faster than it can process it. Below about 6 meters of depth, breathing pure oxygen begins to carry a real risk. Below 30 meters, the risk stops being theoretical. A man breathing pure oxygen at depth can suffer sudden convulsions with no warning, lose consciousness without any sign it was coming, and breathe water before anyone around him understands what is happening. He dies, and the people next to him have no idea what just happened. The Draeger apparatus was rated for use at depths up to about 120 meters according to the technical specification. That number was, to put it plainly, not based on human survival data. It was based on the pressure resistance of the hardware. The hardware might survive at 120 meters. The man breathing through it would not. This was known to German naval medicine. It was known to the engineers at Draegerwerk. It was, apparently, not communicated clearly enough to the men who would actually need the device in combat. There was a second problem that had nothing to do with oxygen. It was the flooding step. To equalize pressure inside a compartment at 250 feet of depth, the air pressure inside had to be raised to match the water pressure outside before the hatch could open. Raising the air pressure to those levels did things to the human body that training pools did not replicate. American naval research conducted after the war on submarine escape data found that at 350 feet, most personnel would be incapacitated or unconscious before pressure equalization was complete. The flooding step that looked manageable in a pool became, at depth, a process that could knock the crew unconscious before they ever reached the hatch. And there was a third problem: the batteries. U-boats ran on large lead-acid batteries when submerged. When seawater reached those batteries, a chemical reaction produced chlorine gas. Not a little chlorine gas, a toxic flood of it, concentrated in the sealed metal tube where the crew was trapped. Depth charges routinely cracked battery housings. Flooding routinely reached batteries. Crew members had died from chlorine poisoning in sunken U-boats before they ever had a chance to attempt an escape. The Draeger apparatus could not save a man who was already unconscious from gas. October 16th, 1943. The Indian Ocean, east of Oman. The submarine U-533, under Commander Henning, had been attacked by a British aircraft from the Royal Air Force, a Bristol Bisley bomber operating from a base in the Middle East. The attack had been effective. The boat took damage it could not recover from and went to the bottom. Inside the sunken submarine, most of the crew died in the initial flooding, but 3 men survived in a sealed compartment. The air was not yet fouled. The pressure was building as water crept in, but slowly enough that they remained conscious. Here is the thing about their escape. They did not use the Draeger apparatus. Whether the devices were not at hand, damaged, or the men simply made a different decision is not recorded with certainty. What is recorded is what they did. They waited while the compartment flooded around them. They stayed calm while the ocean came in. They let the water rise to the point where it equalized with the pressure outside. Then, in the dark, in a submarine that was already on the bottom of the ocean, one of them found the hatch, and it opened. All 3 men got out. All 3 began ascending toward the surface. The depth was not extreme by U-boat standards, and yet even at that depth, the ascent was dangerous. One man lost consciousness on the way up and died. The second man made it to the surface but died about an hour later. The third man was alive in the Indian Ocean alone, treading water, with no vessel in sight and no rescue coming. He drifted for 30 hours before he reached land. He was the sole survivor of a crew of an entire submarine. He had survived by flooding his own compartment, opening the hatch with his bare hands, and swimming to the surface without any escape device at all. The technology that was supposed to save him had played no role. You are 23 years old, and you have been on 3 patrols. You have worn the Draeger apparatus every time you went to action stations. You have been told it works. You trained with it in the pool. You watched an instructor demonstrate how the oxygen valve opens, how the soda-lime cartridge absorbs carbon dioxide, how the buoyancy of the device helps carry you upward even if you stop swimming. You believe this device will save you if the boat goes down. That belief matters. It lets you function. A crew that believed there was absolutely no chance of survival in a sinking submarine would be a crew that could barely operate under combat stress. The escape apparatus was not just practical equipment, it was psychological infrastructure. It told the men that there was a plan. The problem was that the plan had limits nobody had fully tested at combat depths. German submarines typically operated at depths between 100 and 150 meters during evasion. The test depth for most U-boat types was 250 meters. Depth charges frequently drove boats deeper than their designed limits. If a U-boat was attacked and damaged at 200 meters, the Draeger apparatus, whatever the specification sheet said, was equipment designed for a shallower problem than the one the crew was facing. And the crews mostly didn't know this. The gap between what the device is rated for and what a person can survive while using the device was a gap that nobody wanted to explain out loud to the men who were going to need it. Herbert Werner, who commanded U-415 and later wrote the memoir Iron Coffins, described the depth charge experience from inside. He wrote about the terror of the hull plates flexing under pressure, of watching instrument gauges swing beyond their scales, of counting the seconds between explosions and trying to calculate whether the next pattern would be closer. He wrote about the moment when a commander had to decide whether the boat could still rise or whether it was going to keep sinking. The Draeger apparatus was there in those moments, clipped to every man's chest. What it represented, Werner suggested, was the idea that there was something left to try, even at the very end. But the very end, in combat, usually came faster than the apparatus could be used. Most U-boats that were lost went down quickly. A depth charge that cracked the pressure hull brought the ocean in under enormous pressure. Men in the aft compartments died in seconds when a direct hit came through the stern. Flooding that severe didn't leave time for procedure. There was no time to flood a compartment and equalize pressure on purpose when the hull was already doing it on its own, faster than any plan accounted for. The men who had a chance to use the equipment were the ones whose boats sank slowly enough to a depth shallow enough that the procedure remained possible. Those conditions were rare, and even when they existed, the procedure still required everything to go right. October 3rd, 1942, the Atlantic, U-512, under Commander Schulze, went to the bottom at 43 meters. That's a relatively shallow depth by the standards of the war. 43 meters was survivable in theory. The crew had their Draeger apparatus. The depth was within the range where the oxygen toxicity problem was at least reduced compared to deeper water. It should have been one of the scenarios where the device had a genuine chance to work. The seawater reached the batteries first. Chlorine gas filled the compartment. Most of the crew was incapacitated before they could get the hatches open. But 3 men got their devices on in time. 3 men managed to go through the flooding procedure. 3 men made it out through the hatch and began ascending from 43 meters. 1 survived. 2 men died on the way up, or shortly after surfacing. What killed them is not recorded with certainty. The oxygen toxicity, the pressure change, the residual chlorine they had inhaled before escaping, the cold water, any of these could have been fatal, or some combination of several. At 43 meters, with working equipment, with a shallow enough depth that the physics were at least partly favorable, 3 men attempted the escape and 1 came home. Those are the best conditions the device ever operated under in combat. 1943. The U-526, under Commander Moglik, struck a mine returning from an operational patrol. The explosion was violent enough that 12 men on the upper deck were thrown clear. They survived. 9 of them were seriously wounded, but they were on the surface, in the water, with a chance. The rest of the crew was inside when the boat sank. The water was shallow, shallow enough that divers could reach the wreck. And they did. Rescue divers went down and found the submarine on the bottom with crew members still alive inside. They had survived the sinking and the flooding and the weight. They had their escape equipment. The depth was manageable, but the explosion had twisted the hatch housing. The frame that the hatch sat in had been deformed by the force of the mine. The hatch could not be opened from outside. The divers could hear the crew inside, could communicate by tapping on the hull, could tell them they were there, that rescue was being attempted, that someone was working on it. No one could get the hatch open. Everyone inside died. There is no record of exactly how long they waited after the divers arrived. The records state that all crew members trapped inside perished. The divers who worked the wreck and heard them tapping had to surface eventually and report that nothing could be done. The escape apparatus was there, The depth was within range. The will to survive, clearly, was present. The hatch was the deciding factor, and the hatch had been broken by the same explosion that made the escape necessary. January 21st, 1945. The English Channel. The submarine U-1199, under Commander Rolf Nolman, had been hunting in the English Channel when it was caught and attacked. British warships, the destroyer Icarus and the corvette Mignonette, put it on the bottom with depth charges. The boat settled at 73 meters. 73 meters is 240 feet. At that depth, the pressure on every square inch of whatever remains of the hull is enormous. The flooding equalization step would require filling a compartment with water while the air compressed to match the external pressure. The oxygen in the Draeger apparatus, at that depth, was operating well outside the safe range for pure oxygen breathing. At 73 meters, a man using the device was essentially accepting that he might have a seizure underwater at any point in the ascent. One petty officer made it. He got his device on. He went through the flooding procedure. He got the hatch open. He began ascending from 73 meters, breathing pure oxygen, with the pressure decreasing around him as he rose and the toxicity risk shifting as the depth changed. He reached the surface, alive. It remains to this day the deepest known operational escape from a submarine during World War II. One man out of an entire crew. One man in the history of German submarine warfare, who survived an escape from that depth using the Draeger apparatus. He made it look like the system worked because he came home. What the record doesn't show is everyone else. August 20th, 1944, the English Channel, the submarine U-413 had been attacked and bottomed at approximately 27 meters. The leading engineer made his way forward through the boat to investigate the damage. While he was doing this, an air bubble formed, a pocket of compressed air that had been trapped in a compartment during the flooding. It blew him out through an open section and carried him straight to the surface. He survived. He hadn't planned it. He hadn't operated the escape equipment. He hadn't made a decision to escape at all. He had been doing his job, inspecting damage, when physics intervened and delivered him to the surface alive. It was less an escape than an expulsion. It is mentioned in the records alongside the other escapes as though it belongs in the same category. It does not. It was an accident in both directions. He shouldn't have been in that position, and the air bubble that saved him had nothing to do with the Draeger apparatus and everything to do with being in the wrong place at a moment when the wrong place turned out to be exactly right. This is what U-boat escape data looks like at the edges. Some men survived. Some of them survived in ways that had very little to do with what they had been trained to do. The line between a documented escape and a documented death was often a matter of feet. The compartment that flooded slowly enough. The depth that was shallow enough. The hatch that hadn't been twisted by the explosion that sank the boat. May 5th, 1945. The war in Europe had 4 days left. Nobody aboard U-534 knew that. Or rather, they knew that Germany had ordered a ceasefire in several areas, that the end was close, that something was happening at the high command level that would determine whether they surrendered or kept going. Commander Herbert Nollau had received the surrender orders. What he did with them is still debated. What is certain is that on May 5th, U-534 was sailing north through the Kattegat, in company with 2 other submarines, heading toward Norway rather than toward a German port to surrender. 2 British Royal Air Force Liberator bombers found them. The crew of U-534 shot one of the bombers down. The other put a depth charge through the aft section of the boat. The boat began to sink. Most of the 52 men aboard got out before she went under. They escaped through the hatches while the boat was still close to the surface, which is by far the most survivable kind of escape, because the depth is minimal and the physics are cooperative. But 5 men were trapped in the forward torpedo room. The boat settled on the bottom at 67 meters before they could get out. They were now in the same situation as the men of U-512, U-533, U-1199, trapped at depth with flooding coming in, with escape equipment, with a hatch, and with 67 meters of water between them and the air. They went through the procedure. They flooded the compartment. They equalized the pressure. They got the hatch open. All 5 got out. 4 of them survived. The 5th was 17 years old. His name was Josef Neudorfer, a radio operator. He had made it out of the sunken submarine. He had made it through 67 meters of ascent. He was almost there. He didn't exhale. It is a detail that sounds simple. When ascending from depth, the pressure decreases with every meter. The air in your lungs expands as it rises. If you don't breathe out continuously, that expanding air has nowhere to go. It can rupture the lungs. The damage is immediate and catastrophic. This was covered in training. Every sailor who trained with the Draeger apparatus was taught to exhale during ascent. Never hold your breath. It was repeated until it became automatic, or was supposed to become automatic. Josef Neudorfer, 17 years old, ascending toward the surface from 67 meters in the North Sea on May 5, 1945, held his breath. And he died from the damage it did to his lungs. Not from the depth, not from the oxygen, not from the cold or the waiting or the explosion that sank his boat. From one instinctive mistake that every human being makes when they think they might be running out of air. He died a few hundred meters from where the British ships were already pulling his crewmates out of the water. German submarine school was thorough. Every cadet who passed through it spent time in escape training. They practiced in pools. They learned the procedure. They learned the weight of the Draeger apparatus and how the straps sat on the body and which valve controlled the oxygen flow and which valve expelled accumulated carbon dioxide when the soda lime cartridge was starting to saturate. What submarine school could not replicate was depth charge damage, chlorine gas, crew members already unconscious, hatches bent out of alignment, and the psychological state of a man who had been sitting on the bottom of the ocean in a flooded compartment for 40 minutes in the dark while the air pressure equalized. The training was designed for a version of the problem that was cleaner than the problem ever was in combat. There was also the matter of time. The flooding equalization step required patience. The water had to come in gradually enough that the crew could stay conscious as the pressure built. Under combat conditions, this could take anywhere from a few minutes to considerably longer, depending on how badly the hull was compromised. If the boat had taken a direct hit that tore a large section open, flooding was too fast to equalize consciously. If the boat had taken damage that let water in slowly, there was time, but also more time for the batteries to flood. More time for the chlorine to build. The window in which escape was possible was narrower than it appeared on a diagram. Herbert Werner described in his memoir Iron Coffins a patrol in which his boat was forced below design depth during a depth charge attack. Hull plates flexing, gauges swinging past their limits, the whole boat vibrating with each explosion. He described checking the faces of his crew and seeing the same thing in all of them. The knowledge that if the next pattern came in at the right angle, it would be over, and the Draeger apparatus on every man's chest would become the last procedure any of them would ever attempt. In those moments, Werner wrote, a commander's job was to project calm he did not feel, to make decisions sound routine, to give the impression that the situation was one more problem to be solved rather than a countdown to the bottom of the ocean. The device was part of that performance. Its presence on every man's chest said there was still something left to try, even here, even at this depth, even after this attack. The Draeger apparatus was as much a psychological artifact as a practical one. It kept crews functional in situations where the honest assessment would have been paralyzing, and occasionally it kept them alive. The documented escapes from sunken U-boats are few enough that each one has a name attached. U-533, U-512, U-1199, U-413, U-534. These are not many cases for 6 years of war in which nearly 800 submarines were lost. The reason for that is not that the device failed. It is that most of the men who needed it never had the chance to use it. A U-boat hit by a hedgehog pattern at combat depth died in seconds. The hedgehog was a forward-throwing weapon that sent 24 small projectiles in a circular pattern ahead of the attacking ship. If one hit, it detonated on contact with the hull. The explosion at depth, where the water pressure was already enormous, was catastrophic. Pressure hulls that split under that combination did not flood slowly. They opened. A U-boat caught by an aerial depth charge while running deep experienced something similar. The charge detonated at a depth set by its fuse. The explosion did not need to penetrate the hull to kill. The shockwave alone could rupture welded seams, collapse bulkheads, destroy equipment. Men died from the concussion before water reached them. The Draeger apparatus on their chests was irrelevant. This is where the numbers diverge most sharply from the training. Submarine school prepared men for the scenario in which the boat sank slowly to a manageable depth and remained structurally intact enough that the hatch could open. That scenario did exist. It appeared in the documented cases every time someone survived. But the far more common scenario was a boat that died faster and harder than any procedure could address. There is a record of a U-boat whose commander surfaced after a depth charge attack and found that a third of his crew had died, not from flooding, but from concussion. No water in their lungs, no chlorine. The shockwave had simply been fatal. The survivors were lucky by a margin they had no way to quantify, standing on the casing of a damaged boat on the surface of the Atlantic, watching the men they couldn't save float in the same water the boat had just been fighting to escape. The Draeger apparatus was found on the bodies of men pulled from wrecks by Allied divers, still clipped to their chests, unused, not because they had decided against it, because circumstances had decided for them. There is one U-boat loss from the final weeks of the war that belongs in any discussion of what actually killed submarines, because it illustrates how many different ways a boat could be lost that had nothing to do with enemy action. April 14th, 1945. The submarine U-1206, operating in the North Sea 8 nautical miles off the coast of Peterhead, Scotland. The boat was at 61 meters of depth, conducting its first active combat patrol. U-1206 had been fitted with the new high-pressure toilet system. The older toilets on German submarines could only be flushed while the boat was at shallow depth, because sea pressure pushed back through the system when running deep. The new design was supposed to solve this with a high-pressure countervalve system that allowed flushing at any depth. It worked correctly if the valves were operated in the right sequence. In the wrong sequence, it opened the system to the sea. Flushing the toilet required following a procedure complicated enough that the boat carried specially trained technicians to operate it. Commander Karl Adolf Schlitt needed to use the head. Accounts differ on exactly what happened next, but the result was clear. Valves were operated in the wrong order. The sea came in through the toilet system. Large amounts of seawater flooded the bilges. Seawater reached the forward battery compartment. Chlorine gas. The commander surfaced to save his crew from the gas. On the surface, the boat was spotted and attacked by British aircraft. Schlitt ordered it scuttled and the crew to abandon ship. 4 men died. The rest were captured. U-1206 was lost to a toilet. The Draeger apparatus aboard played no role. The sinking was too fast and the solution was surfacing, not escaping from depth. But the chlorine gas from the batteries was the same mechanism that killed men in U-512 and threatened every crew that took flooding damage deep. Whatever sank the boat, the batteries could always kill the survivors. It was the consistent secondary threat that no piece of personal equipment could address. After the war, American naval analysts compiled data on submarine escape attempts from all navies. The numbers were examined carefully in the context of a major report called War Damage Report 58, which looked at what had worked and what hadn't in submarine rescue. The finding that mattered most was this: the chance of surviving an individual escape attempt decreased by roughly 10% for every 30 feet of additional depth. At 250 feet and beyond, the chance of survival was assessed as very small. In practice, that meant that anything over about 75 meters was essentially a death sentence, regardless of what equipment the men were wearing. 75 meters. That number would be relevant for practically any U-boat that had been on a combat dive when it was hit. Combat depth for a Type 7 was 100 meters or more. Evasion depth was often far greater. A submarine attacked while running at 150 meters had already passed the survivability threshold for escape before it even stopped moving. Of the men who did manage to get out of sunken submarines and begin ascending, about 75% reached the surface alive. But that number conceals what it took to get to the starting line. The vast majority of men who died in sunken submarines never had a chance to attempt an escape at all. They died in the initial flooding, or from chlorine gas, or at depths where even attempting the procedure was not survivable. The Draeger apparatus saved men when the conditions cooperated. At shallow depth, with an intact hatch, without battery flooding, with enough time to complete the equalization procedure, a man had a real chance. The problem was that combat rarely arranged itself to provide all of those conditions simultaneously. Most U-boats that were sunk in ways that removed most of those conditions immediately. There is a detail in the history of U-526 that doesn't show up in the statistics. The divers reached the wreck. They found men alive inside. They tapped on the hull and received taps in return. That means the crew knew they had been found. They knew someone was above them, working to get them out. They sat in the flooding compartment with their Draeger apparatus in their hands or on their chests, and they waited while people on the outside tried to solve the problem of the hatch. No one has recorded how long this lasted. The official accounts note only that the hatch housing had been deformed and could not be opened, and that everyone inside perished. The gap between those two facts is a length of time that the crew spent waiting for something that was not going to happen. This is the part of the escape apparatus story that the statistics don't capture. The device didn't just fail mechanically, at depth, with chemistry, with physics. It also failed by creating a situation in which men had reason to believe a rescue was possible, and then waited, with that belief, while the rescue became impossible. And in other cases, the men of U-533, the one petty officer from U-1199, the 4 survivors of U-534's torpedo room. The device and the procedure and the training gave men a genuine chance, and they took it. The outcomes were exactly as terrible as the data predicted, and also, occasionally, something other than death. That occasional survival was real. It wasn't fiction, and it wasn't luck precisely. It was the device working under conditions favorable enough that it could work. The problem was that those conditions were the exception. The device was not a lie. It was a device built for a problem that the sea mostly refused to. Present in the form the device was designed for. Herbert Nolau was 30 years old when the British plane found U-534 in the Kattegat. He was captured and held briefly as a prisoner of war, then released when the fighting ended. He went home. He found work with the German Postal Service. He lived for 23 years after the war. He never explained why he was sailing north on May 5, 1945, away from Germany, with the ceasefire already in effect in several areas. He never explained the 3 experimental acoustic torpedoes found in the aft section of his boat when it was salvaged in 1993. Torpedoes so advanced that only 38 of them were ever built, at a cost that made each one a significant investment. Where was he going with them? Norway. Further. He took those answers with him in 1968. What he left behind was the wreck of U-534, which sat on the bottom of the Kattegat for 41 years until a Danish diver found it. They raised it in 1993, cut it into sections, moved it to Birkenhead, England. It became a museum exhibit called the U-boat story. You can walk through sections of it today, or could until the attraction closed in 2020. The torpedo loading hatch, through which 4 men swam to the surface on May 5, 1945, is part of the preserved boat. The section where Josef Neudorfer spent his last minutes underwater is preserved in the same material that preserved him. The cold North Sea that keeps things unchanged for decades. The last U-boat escape of the war was U-534's torpedo room, May 5, 1945. 4 survivors, 1 casualty. Josef Neudorfer was 17 years old. He had been born in 1927 or 28. He had come of age as Germany entered the war, trained as a radio operator, been assigned to a submarine that had spent most of its service life in training and weapons testing rather than combat. He had survived everything the war had thrown at him. He had survived the sinking. He had survived the compartment flooding. He had survived 67 meters of North Sea. He died 100 meters from open air because he was 17, and he held his breath. Germany surrendered 4 days later. He was 4 days from surviving the war. The U-boat fleet lost approximately 30,000 men, killed out of 40,000 who served. 3 out of 4. The escape apparatus, the Draeger device, the device every one of them wore in combat and trained with and trusted. It saved a handful of men in documented cases across 6 years of war. It promised more than that. It always promises more than that. Every piece of survival equipment does. The 30,000 it couldn't save weren't failures of the device. They were failures of the conditions the device needed. Shallow enough, slow enough, intact enough. The ocean's job was to be none of those things. It was very good at its job.